Welcome back to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Chris Bedford, Senior Editor at the Federalist, and I'm here joined today by the Executive Director of the National Civic Art Society, Justin Shubow, and also James McCrery, who is the Director of Classical Architecture at the Catholic University of America, and also a member of the National Civic Art Society. Thank you both for joining me.
Great to be here, Chris.
This week has been an exciting week for classical architecture, for American architecture, and for the American people who, as you might have noticed over the years, are subjected to what the government builds all the time. If you happen to live in Boston, you've seen both beautiful architecture and about the ugliest architecture the government has ever constructed. But there are differing points of view on this. Now it's back in the news right now, as opposed to just a daily part of our lives, because President Trump earlier this week signed an executive order to make classical architecture the architectural style of Washington, D.C., and also to make at least a search for beauty and an attempt to move into the history and to reflect the cultures of the United States in any kind of federal architecture over a certain amount of money being spent around the world, around the country. So that includes courthouses, that includes any number of federal buildings or department headquarters. But it can be a bit complicated at some points, because this is an issue that even though we're all subjected to, sometimes we don't all know the details about. So I'd love to hear, Justin, what makes this order something that's going to affect Americans in their day-to-day lives?
It's important to understand that the Founding Fathers consciously chose classical architecture for the design of Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington personally oversaw the competitions for the White House and the Capitol, and they sought classical architecture to harken back to ancient Greece and Rome, Republican Rome and democratic Greece. They also saw the architecture as time-honored and timeless, and they wanted America, the new nation, to follow within that tradition. And for decades and decades, classical architecture was the architecture of American democracy. By and large, that was the case up until after World War II, when the federal government rejected classicism in favor of modernism. Modernism is this austere, functionalist aesthetic essentially based on man as a machine. And it completely rejected the past. It completely rejected even beauty as such. And that trend in architecture was solidified in 1962 with so-called guiding principles for federal architecture that were originally just one page in a report on federal office space.
Right.
But those principles became became the basis for federal architecture. And if you've ever been around Washington, D.C., you'll see all these amazing classical buildings, and then you'll also see hideous modernist federal buildings, including the FBI building, which is brutalist. I call it the Ministry of Fear. HUD headquarters. Really, these buildings defaced our capital and made it, far more of an ugly place. So, and there was this negative trend around the country too, not just in Washington. And in more recent years, it's not just modernist designs, but discordant postmodernist designs that we're getting around the country. There is one new courthouse in Salt Lake City that's been called a Borg cube.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
You could look at there is a federal building in San Francisco that looks like some kind of alien spacecraft, again, that's about to kill you. And
I like how they really rub it in, where if you're sitting on the park benches at this building, it kind of feels like there's a guillotine hanging above your head. It's really terrifying.
It's absolutely the case. And in fact, it's funny you should mention that, since the architect, a guy named Tom Main, also designed a federal courthouse in Portland. I'm sorry, not in Portland, but another place in Oregon. And he said that he put symbolic guillotines over the judges' benches.
Oh, it's lovely.
As sort of, he didn't.
That's very clever.
Meant it as some kind of joke. But that's all leading up to what just happened this week, where overturning 60 dismal years of federal architecture, President Trump signed this executive order that would reorient federal architecture in a classical and traditional direction. So I should note that although it requires that new federal buildings in Washington, D.C. be classical, outside of D.C., what there is a requirement that federal buildings be beautiful, that they command the admiration of the American people, and that there should be particular regard for classical and traditional architecture. I make sure to say classical and traditional, since traditional includes things like Spanish colonial, mission revival, colonial revival, different kinds of architecture other than, having columns and pediments, because there is a history, of course, in America of different kinds of traditional architecture and federal buildings using that architecture. Yeah. So there is going to be a diversity of styles, but the intent is for there to be particular regard for classical and traditional architecture.
And uplifting architecture, the kind that makes you think about your ancestors, your country, your national purpose, your future, all together. So James,
and your responsibilities and your obligations as a citizen.
Yes, exactly.
This is what our architecture can communicate at its best, and that's the kind of architecture that is truly called civic, and that a great civilization like ours needs and demands, and it's called for. And we don't get it. We've been fed a steady diet. There's a whole bunch of people out there who will tell you, oh, no, well, though they can point to one or two other traditional buildings that aren't modernist and say, see, there's lots of diversity here. In fact, those few buildings are the exception that prove the rule of an absolutely boring monoculture that has been erected for the American people by the General Services Administration and by architects who design buildings for architects for the last 50, 60, 70 years. So that rather than having an architecture of the people for the people, we have architecture by architects for architects. So Justin points up the example of Tom Maine putting a wink, wink, and a nod to have a guillotine over the head of the judge, and that's not for the people. That's so that Tom Maine's friends can get the joke right and say, that Uncle Tom, what a great fellow he is.
So
right?
Who are the constituents, James, against this order? Because it's not without controversy. You would think that make architecture beautiful and in the American tradition would be largely without controversy, but of course it's 2020, so there's nothing without controversy.
Well, there has been a lot of controversy this year. I think an early draft of the executive order was leaked early on, I think February of 2020. And sure enough, the press, the architecture critics who are, famously important people in American culture, descended upon it. The AIA had something to say, against the president's intentions. And it's drummed up this big controversy. We can't have classical architecture anymore. It's not architecture of our time. There's a bunch of practicing traditional and classical architects who would object, but they don't even have to voice their objection. Their careers, their firms, populated with hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of traditional and classical architects, are proof that that's simply not the case. That traditional and classical architecture is very much of our time. It's very much alive and well. In schools of architecture, Notre Dame, University of Miami, now the Catholic University of America, where I teach, are all very much committed to traditional and classical architectural design in their education, and they're graduating immensely talented students year in and year out, and they're going out and finding work.
I think it's important to recognize that most of the opposition to the executive order has been from architectural elites and the media who kowtow to them. Yeah. So, for instance, the New York Times wrote an editorial opposing the executive order when it was leaked, saying that what it was calling for were quote-unquote fake Roman columns. In other words, the idea that any classical architecture is fake. Right. And my response to that is, well, is the Jefferson Memorial fake Roman columns?
Right.
Does the Supreme Court have fake columns on it? Absolutely not.
The Lincoln Memorial, right? Yeah. which is an exquisite building and very, very carefully designed and perhaps even better built than the original Greek temples that inspire it. It's a brilliant, brilliant building and wonderfully executed. It's an absolute classical masterpiece. I'd put it up against any of the Greek temples anywhere, or any of the Roman temples or civic and public buildings anywhere throughout history. We're entirely capable of doing this excellent work. And those buildings, more importantly, it's not really about the architects. It's about what the buildings do for the people. It's not architecture for architects. It's not architecture for architecture's sake. It is architecture for the people, and ultimately for our society. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Oh, sure.
Justin, you conducted a survey at the National Civic Arts Society of the American people, and I was curious to see that, because some of the criticism, including from members of Congress, has been that to sign this order is anti-democratic. But it seems to me, based on the results of your survey, which I'd like you to talk to us about, that it's entirely democratic, and in fact, the rule by experts, which is what we've been subjected to for the past 60 years or 70 years or so, is what's undemocratic.
Absolutely. Since at least World War II, essentially, federal architecture has been run by government bureaucrats with essentially no accountability, completely flying under the radar. And all of that has changed thanks to this order. You mentioned the National Civic Arts Society survey. We hired the Harris Poll, the nonpartisan polling company, to do a survey of 2,000 random American adults. And we showed them, we compared photographs of existing federal buildings that were chosen to have similar shape and scale and color and so on, and asked which of these two would you prefer for a federal building or U.S. courthouse. 72% of the people polled preferred the traditional design, and there were majorities across every demographic group, whether it's socioeconomic, geography, gender, race, ethnicity, even political party. There were large majorities favoring the traditional option. So what this proves is what everyone already really knew, is that laypersons, as opposed to elite architects, really do prefer classical and traditional architecture.
And it's as bipartisan as you can get. You just mentioned there the Jefferson and the Lincoln, the two great founders of our two great current political parties in America. And James, you're an architect, and I remember talking to you previously about the attempts to rebuild, or the movement to rebuild Notre Dame Cathedral after it burned, and the pushback that we received from people who said we don't have craftsmen who can work like this. Now, you have in the past few years built beautiful cathedrals in the United States, and also smaller buildings throughout the United States. How do you know, and how can you be certain that we're able to build these?
Well, the craft is there, and the craftability and the artisanship and the desire on the part of craftsmen is there to use their skills at the highest possible levels and deliver, this excellence day in and day out. They really truly want to do that. It is a red herring. I know it to be true, where people will say, "Well, you can't make good quality buildings anymore," and then because they, I think, ultimately understand that their designs are not high quality buildings, so they try to lay it off, saying, they being architects, lay it off saying, well, it can't be done, right? No one's around who can make plaster. No one is around who can carve stone. No one's around who can really carve wood and shape it into beautiful trusses and that sort of thing. Well, the answer is, well, yes, indeed, there are, and they're all over the place, and they're all hungry and thirsty for work. High quality stuff. Who wants to build cabinets when you can make, an altar, right? So they'd much rather do those things. So can we make these buildings? I think is where you're going with this.
And great teachers, the building themselves.
Absolutely, and they love doing it. And sure, you might find somebody who's entirely capable of doing it who hasn't done it yet. But having not done something is not an indication of an inability. It's an indication of potentially an indication of a desire. So it's really it's a failure of the practice of architecture over the last half century that it can be argued that there are no longer people who can do these things. Well, whose fault's that? It's the architects who fail to design buildings that are challenging for craftspeople to make. But there are plenty of people out there to do it. France has no fear at all of delivering the right craftsmen, whether they be roofers, framers, gilders, stonemasons, carvers. They're completely confident of delivering everything that they want and need to get Notre Dame rebuilt. I'm completely confident that our society can deliver the very, very, very best craftsmanship to make these great buildings in the classical and traditional manner.
I would add to that there is modern technology that also brings down the cost of carving stone. They're so-called CNC machines that can do essentially a first draft of a pediment or a column, and then maybe it can be hand finished. And so, we don't need to hire 10,000 Italian craftsmen with a hammer and chisel.
Right. Yeah.
To do the work. Yeah. There's modern technology that can and is being used. I would point to one exceptional new federal building that is classical, that proves that it still can be done, and that's the Tuscaloosa Federal Courthouse, which is done in Greek temple style. Mm-hmm. It's a new building.
It's very good.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's been extremely successful with courthouse workers, with the public, and it proves that it can be done, that we don't have to tolerate ugly, demoralizing buildings.
Now, I was just talking about the demoralizing aspects of architecture just before you got here, and bad architecture. And in the past, I've been able to spend Christmases in Boston and go out Christmas Eve with a bunch of old friends who still lived in the area. And right downtown in Boston, you've got Faneuil Hall, which is a beautiful gathering place, cobblestones, classical or old colonial architecture. And across the street from that, you have the Customs House Tower. And this is, it feels like America. It feels like Christmas. It feels like history. You can feel history coming from the stones. Now, just a short, maybe 2 blocks up, you have Government Center, with some of the brutalist architecture of that, the state houses, the police, the state police headquarters, things that might not be on the subject to this. But you mentioned beforehand that architecture in Boston, which is universally disliked by the citizens, it has been called some of the best architecture by the architects themselves.
The American Institute of Architects once did a poll finding that the Boston City Hall, one of the ugliest buildings on the planet, is one of the greatest buildings in American history. And there are some...
Who they poll?
That was a poll.
Themselves.
That was a poll of architects, not ordinary, or not of ordinary.
They didn't poll
Americans.
Dunkin' Donuts.
There was a...
Well, I was just going to say, there was one honest modernist architect, a guy named Philip Johnson, who parenthetically was a former Nazi, who said about the Boston City Hall, "I love it. It's so ugly."
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's so endearing. And it's really hard to tear down, too. They made those things fairly durable.
Well, some people believe that brutalism, the style of the building, and many government buildings in America, derives from Nazi fortifications. If you look at the so-called flak towers that were built in Europe during World War II, it's reinforced concrete, and you'll start seeing the similarities between brutalism and these Nazi fortifications.
And like with a beautiful classical building, it can be used for anything. You've seen old police departments in New York City that are now used for very high range condominiums. You can use that building for anything. And the old flak houses of Nazi Germany are now crack houses. So they can be reused as well. Society has many uses.
Yes, well, what a good reuse, right? Yeah.
Well, it's
I'm not sure that's a step up or a step down.
It's funny you should say that, since
Sideways.
There's a strong argument to be made that traditional architecture is the most sustainable architecture because it is adaptable and reusable, and also beloved, and thus because of all of that, it doesn't get torn down.
Right. You make it beautiful. People, I hold forth on this at the university. The Catholic University of America. The best sustainable building is the beautiful building, and that's a word that we need to get back to. The presidential order, the executive order, does do that. President Trump speaks about beauty in his order. What a wonderful word. It's a difficult word, and it has been avoided by architects, by artists, by fashion designers for so long, for too long. We need to re-embrace it. It's a difficult concept, and it's not relative. There is such a thing as objective beauty, and that it's the fact that it's objective is what makes it difficult. If everything is subjective, then anyone can do anything, and then that it's actually quite easy. But beauty is not subjective; it's objective, and it's therefore challenging. But nonetheless, we have to embrace that challenge and get at it. Back to the AIA, it was interesting. They did write a brief piece in their own journal recently. I think it was online where I saw it. But they were talking about the National Civic Arts Society's poll and the findings of the poll. And they noted very, very importantly early on in the article that, well, no architects were polled. At least we don't know that architects were polled, as if that's the most important thing for the American Institute of Architects to be sure, well, how many of these people were architects?
How many were experts? We have that
Right.
cult of expertise.
Right. The whole point is lost on them, I think, unfortunately, and hopefully that will begin to change as things move forward. But architects need to understand that they are servants of society, especially, not only in all their commissions, but most especially in their civic architecture commissions. They're servants of the polis. They're servants of the society, and they need to design buildings that put forth the framework of our amazing nation, and that uphold our magnificent history, but also encourage people and inspire citizens to become ever better and make our country ever and ever and ever better. And architecture can do that, and since it can, it should.
There's this overarching pattern we've seen over the past few years with whether it's coronavirus or architecture or any other subject, where there's always an appeal that you can't speak about it unless you've got a degree, an expert degree. And one of the big problems with this is that as opposed to degrees filtering as they once did for your talent and your knowledge, more and more these days your degrees are filtered for your ideology. And it seems like they have, I'm not sure, architecture, where you two are much more schooled than I am, but in a lot of these different fields, political science, the experts are typically more ideologically aligned than anything. Well,
it's fair to say that there is an ideology in architecture, and that is modernism and its progeny. Mm-hmm. When students go to architecture school, they probably think or view buildings a lot like lay people, but the schools essentially deform their minds and brainwash them so that by the time they come out, they love buildings that most people hate. And in fact, there have been empirical academic studies showing that there's a great disconnect between the preferences of architects and of laypersons. One study found that not only is there this great difference, but that architects cannot even predict how ordinary people will experience a building.
Right.
That's how far apart their mind has become. I don't think these architects were born that way. I think it's their education that caused that, unfortunately. And you mentioned the experts versus the people. Unlike other arts, such as a painting or a book, architecture is public. It's forced upon us. If you don't want to see a painting, don't go to the museum. If you don't want to, don't read the book if you don't want to read it. But since architecture is forced upon us, it is political, inherently political. It either makes our lives better or makes our lives worse. And when it comes to our civic architecture, it's explicitly political. Mm-hmm. I mean, our tax dollars are paying for it. And these buildings speak to who we are as a people, what our beliefs are, what is our sense of time, our values. And so therefore, it's all the more important that those decisions be made democratically as opposed to by some government bureaucrats.
But so there's been some worry, and certainly it's justified, that this past administration has shown how delicate executive orders can be. Mm-hmm. Much of what President Barack Obama accomplished was undone by President Donald Trump through executive order. I'm going back both ways. What would you say to those who think that this executive order is here to stay for 3 months?
Well, I'm optimistic that President Biden and his administration will see that the buildings that are the result of this executive order are beautiful, great buildings that Americans can take pride in, and that they will see that this is a nonpartisan issue. The same thing that our poll has showed. This is not a partisan issue. And
that's
so
a critical
therefore,
point. It's a very critical point.
President Biden can, be supportive of classical architecture for Washington, D.C. I mean, in fact, there's an irony that when President Obama gave his nomination speech, he actually spoke on a stage that was Greek architecture.
And he was mocked by architects for doing it.
He was mocked by the modernist architects.
Right, yeah.
But the fact is, he wanted to associate himself with that architecture because that is the architecture of American democracy. And I don't think Biden has drunk the modernist Kool-Aid. He is a layperson. He's not an architectural expert, and that is all the better.
James, tell me about some of the education that you've been working to do over the past few years. You left not simply doing private practice and your nonprofit work to try and go into the schools, and I'm sure you faced some pushback throughout the years. How are the students reacting when they come into a classroom and they're hearing something that hasn't been taught in most architecture schools for quite a while?
Well, it's a breath of fresh air, I think, for them. I know it is for me. I'm new to academia. I'm only just now in my 5th academic year and well into my 50s. So I came very late to academia, recruited to it to introduce classical architecture at a school that has its roots in the education of classical architecture, beginning in the early years of the 20th century. But then, like Justin said, I fell into this predictable pattern of almost every single school of architecture. Actually, every single school of architecture in North America after World War II. They just went whole hog modernist, and throwing out some throwing out their libraries even. But there was a full-scale shunning of tradition, of any form, in order to make room for and then commit wholesale to modernism, and all the stuff that comes with modernism. And there's a lot there that comes with it. Well, I walked in, and it was new to me, and I was new to them, and I explained who I was and what my purpose for being there was. And I immediately got a oversubscribed course, and that's how it's been really since then. So we've been able to add more classical professors to the faculty on a permanent basis. We've been adding more adjunct classical faculty to teach courses on temporary or interim bases. And we've just been blessed by the university with a new dean of School of Architecture at Catholic University. His name is Mark Ferguson. He's an extremely successful, deeply knowledgeable, and committed gentleman educator. And like me, he had no experience in academia either. Part of that is because he's a very successful businessman and built this wonderful firm in Manhattan. Another part of it is something that most classicists have in common, Chris, and that is that we're shunned from the academy. So, well, where are these classicists? Well, they're people who don't apply for positions because they know it's a complete and total waste of time. Like I said, I didn't apply. I was recruited to come, and I've met with stern resistance from a good part of the, not all, but a good part of the faculty for 5 years, and just hold the line, speak truth, teach beauty, and keep at it. So that's been my experience, and I'm just pleased as punch to be involved in it. But it's always, you're always pushing the wheelbarrow up the hill, and I don't even mind that. It's because I know what we're doing is good, it's true, and it's beautiful. So those are 3 good things to be committed to as an architect, and it's I can't tell you, it's so delightful. The students love it. Admittedly, sometimes we get students because they're being contrarian. They want to sort of kick the status quo a little bit. I'll take them on that basis. Mostly, I get students who really want to study traditional and classical architecture. What a unique opportunity that's been placed in front of them, and they seize it, and they do superb work. But and sometimes I end up teaching modernist students because of the way the work begins, and I get converts from modernism. So it's fantastic.
But you are yourself.
I am also a convert from modernism and postmodernism. So yeah, I'm experienced with all that stuff. It's a lot of fun.
Justin, what's some of the work that the National Civic Arts Society does? I know that aside from this project which you've pushed for, you've also worked on the Eisenhower Memorial and a big project that you have right now that I'm not sure what the latest updates are on. Is redoing the station in York, Penn Station, or at least seeing how you can sway that debate in the public's mind.
So sure. Right now we have a project in New York City. Originally, our goal was to try to reconstruct the original Penn Station, which was this magnificent classical design built in 1910, one of the greatest buildings in American history. Yep. It had a soaring hall that was so big that you could fit the envelope of Grand Central Terminal inside of it. And the building was torn down in 1963 and replaced by the current Penn Station, which is one of the worst places in America.
Oh, it's horrible.
As one architectural historian famously said regarding the station's history, one used to enter the station, and one used to enter the city like a god. Now one scuttles in like a rat.
It feels like that when you come in. I have to take the train up there a lot, at least before coronavirus shut down New York. You have to avoid certain staircases because of sewage leaking from the ceilings, and you're trying to get out as quickly as possible. Yeah,
it's a horrible, depressing place and is emblematic of modernist architecture from that time period.
It was a promised improvement, though. This is the thing: is that get rid of this stuff. You don't need it. All that extra space. It's probably burning up a lot of energy and that sort of thing. We'll fix it for you. We've got this great idea, and what you get is this, right?
So, right. Everyone agrees that we need a new Penn Station. The question is, what is it going to look like? And what we are advocating for now is a classical station evocative of the original, if not a precise reconstruction of it. Yeah. Since there could be different needs, technological and infrastructure needs of today, and there are various factors.
Yeah, and trains are different now, and that sort of thing.
Actually, historic train stations can quite accommodate the modern technology.
Completely agreed.
They're historic.
Completely agreed. Yeah.
And Grand Central Terminal, which is from around the same time period, is an incredibly effective train station.
Yeah.
But our goal is for people to see what the original looked like, to realize the sorts of stations that we used to build in this country and can build again.
Yeah.
And what's some of the day-to-day or week-to-week work of the National Civic Arts Society in America, and how people might be able to get involved with it or learn more about it?
Well, I encourage people to visit our website, civicart.org. Also, the poll we've been talking about is located there. At the same time, we put on tours, we have lectures. A number of them can be found on our YouTube channel. You can just Google us.
Yeah, the poll's actually really fun. It's already been taken, but it's presented in a way on the website where you can take it yourself, right? So you just, even though you won't be a participant, you can just get on there and say, you have these slide pairs where you say, well, do I like the FBI building or do I? And it's really kind of fun. It's a really delightful event to get on there and take a look. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but go take a look at that poll. Seeing's believing.
How do you think of the future right now? Because a lot of conservatives in academia feel like they're on the route. A lot of conservatives in the church feel like they're on the route in political society after a brief moment of sunshine for a lot of people. And I know that this is not a conservative versus liberal thing, but this is a traditional American and more traditional across the globe versus some of the new. And so much of the old has been being torn down in place of the new. I want to get both of your takes on this, but your bullishness or bearishness on Americans wanting to, when so much is changing, return to something that's more timeless.
Well, I think you put it well. I mean, if we're living in a society where there is constant change, isn't it nice to have something that is secure and homely? And traditional architecture can provide that. It can provide a sense of place in a world where everything is, kind of going crazy. And so there is an argument why we need traditional architecture all the more than in the past. I mean, I am optimistic about the future of architecture. In Europe, for instance, there are lots of instances of historic buildings being reconstructed. Right now, there is a big palace in Berlin that's underway, and there have been similar structures throughout the continent. And it's Europeans wanting to return to their heritage. And similarly, in America, most people, given the option, would choose the traditional option. And this executive order is bringing attention to the fact that, wait a second, there's a choice. We don't have to put up with bad architecture. And so therefore things like this can lead us in a better direction.
It can, and it will. We just have to have the sort of societal maturity to follow through and build in this way, the way that societies have built for ages and ages and ages. What I find is that, and I think what Americans find, is that this constant insistence on newness that we've been fed for 70 years is really quite old. It's tiresome. It's the same thing over and over again. I can write the reviews verbatim practically for them. They don't. I mean, they can just go through a file card and pull it out and say, "Oh yes, this is not of its age. These are not new materials. This sort of thing." So it's really kind of humorous to hear the arguments that are made in favor of modernist architecture. They're not persuasive, and they're unoriginal, and they've been offered for the last century, and people aren't convinced. I think by now, modernism has been around as a style of architecture since the late 19th century. It's been around in North America since the beginning decades of the 20th century, and it's been foisted upon the American people with very, very few exceptions since after World War II for the last 70 years. You'd think by now, if modernism was going to ever be persuasive, it would already have been, and that the poll that the National Civic Art Society just conducted would have concluded, or would have found completely different results. But it didn't. We found that people still want, despite all of these arguments for modernism, people say, humbug, I still want classical architecture, thank you very much. Architects are unwilling to listen to the people. By and large. Not all of us, but by and large. And they need to. Theirs, as Justin said, theirs is necessarily civic art. You can go into the National Gallery of Art and look at a picture. You can go into the National Gallery of Art and look at a statue, or not. You can choose not to. This is what you were saying, right? But you can't choose to not see the National Gallery of Art. So it better be a good building, because you're foisting it upon the visual culture of the nation. Therefore, they should be excellent buildings.
And, regarding the National Gallery of Art, which is this beautiful classical building, when it was constructed, the head of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, which was, the leading place to study modernism, he called that building a pink marble whorehouse.
Yeah.
That gives you a sense of the mentality of a modernist architect, this amazing, beautiful museum, a museum that FDR beautifully praised actually at its opening, talking about how it combines the best of the past with modern technology, and yet we have the dean of this graduate school calling it a whorehouse.
Yeah.
That's incredible, and it's strange, and there's a lot of excitement, as you mentioned earlier. Brutalism is now trending, did you say, on Twitter?
Well, it's trending in response to the executive order.
Yes.
People want to know what it is.
What is this brutalism?
What is brutalism?
And it makes so much sense when you look it up. You say, oh, Yeah, that's brutalism.
And who would call themselves brutal, right? But brutalists, our architects like that. They like that. They're like, yes, I will wear that as a badge. It is brutal. It's an apt term. It's spot on. It is brutal, and the brutality of that brutal architecture is a brutality against and onto the people that have to experience it. You were talking earlier about your hometown and the city hall and the what's the name of that oval emptiness? What's the name of the square?
City Center.
Government Center. Government Center. That's really
so
good.
Wonderful. It's so nice and cozy. And homeless people hang out there sometimes.
I mean, I think some of the fans of brutalism, which are really what you might call sophisticates,
yeah,
they're drawn to it because of its offensiveness, because of it's noxious. I mean, it's sort of analogous to certain kinds of atonal music. There's avant-garde classical music that sounds like nails on a chalkboard. And you know what? If people want to listen to that, that's fine. They're welcome to go to a concert hall
turn it down
and listen to it. But it's not like walking around public listening to that music. And that's what it is like to see certain of these buildings.
Where will we start to see this order take effect first? I know that they just approved 2 new Smithsonians. There are more courthouses being built. Where can people look to see this in action?
That's a good question. I mean, the order goes into effect immediately, as far as I understand. I guess the question is what federal buildings and courthouses are coming down the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And those buildings are ones that will be affected by the order. Already, I should say, under the current administration, one bright light is there was a requirement that the new forthcoming federal courthouse in Fort Lauderdale be classical. So that's going to be another exception to this 60-year trend of modernist buildings. And it was great to see that Fort Lauderdale, a significantly sized American city, is going to have a new classical courthouse.
Well, that's great news. Thank you both for joining us today, James McCrery and Justin Shubow. I'm Chris Bedford, Senior Editor of the Federalist. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll see you next time, and until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.